constitution as an instrument of government. A few weeks ago I revisited the Ken Loach film The Spirit of 45, which relates how the post-war Labour government created a new consensus for a more equal and fair society developed on the solid pillars of a welfare state based on the determination that poverty would be eradicated, that inequalities would be challenged, and that everyone regardless of background, would have the opportunity to fulfil their potential to lead a healthy and rewarding life from cradle to grave. In a land where young people were offered hope and all but a guarantee that their generation would be better off than that of their parents. And how distant those aspirations now seem. I look around me today and see the demonisation of the poor, the weak, the disabled, the casual and cynical abuse levelled at working class communities and the have-nots by a media dominated by the haves, the public school elites, churning out the lies and disinformation peddled by opportunistic politicians. And I genuinely wonder what kind of country we live in today. A country where the vast majority of people are just a few pay packets away from destitution. A country where people have to go cap in hand to food banks. A country where children are again turning up in doctors' surgeries with rickets. And a country in which, behind a thin veneer of a civilised society, there are alarming increases in hate crime against people on benefits and the disabled. A country in which most young people face the prospect of low pay, poor employment conditions, with little chance of owning their own homes and very little chance of social housing. A country with a vast pool that is the new precariat, those people moving out of benefits into short-term low-paid work or on zero-hour contracts and then back onto benefits again, unable to break out of that cycle of below subsistence benefits and poverty wages. And a country in which libraries and swimming pools and youth centres are closing at an alarming rate. And I ask myself, just how have we come to this in what is, after all, still the 6th richest country on earth? So if I can beg your indulgence, I'd like to remind ourselves again of how most of the constructs of the modern welfare state were established after World War II as part of that great national consensus around a social democratic system with a mixed economy of state control and private enterprise that lasted over 30 years. And it worked. That post-war Labour government built and invested their way out of debt and created the foundations for the longest period of growth, economic stability and increasing prosperity for all sectors of society in the whole of British economic history. But in 1979 we saw the end of that consensus. From that point on we saw the election of a succession of neoliberal conservative governments hell-bent on reducing the size of the state and privatising state assets at whatever the economic and social cost, all based on some Mickey Mouse notion that an unfettered free market would cure all the country's perceived ills, and that all we had to do was allow the rich to get richer still, and the trickle-down of such wealth would make us all better off. And of course it was economic insanity. The damage to the manufacturing base was enormous, unemployment soared to 3 million, benefits were slashed, particularly for the under-25s, and not surprisingly homelessness reached previously unseen levels. For the best part of 2 decades, the North Sea oil revenues that could and should have made us the richest country on earth were squandered on unemployment benefits, deliberately engineered battles with the trade unions, and tax cuts for the rich. And of course, one of the first things that Thatcher and her good friend Ronald Reagan did was to deregulate the UK and US financial markets, disregarding all the historical evidence that deregulated markets will eventually lead to economy-threatening financial crashes. My, how that one came back to bite us all with a vengeance. Now, one of the principal tenets of those Conservative administrations was that the previous model of state welfare created perverse incentives that encouraged people to remain idle and feckless. Ministers began rehashing mantras about the undeserving poor that date right back to the Workhouse and the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834. And at the same time, a level of previously unheard of nastiness entered national discourses around the theme that not only were those on benefits a drain on society, they were something to be despised. So in the 1980s, we had Conservative Housing Minister George Young shamelessly telling an incredulous journalist that, and I quote, "The homeless are people you step over on the way to the opera." And we had Norman Tebbie pronouncing that the unemployed should get on their bikes to find work, the insinuation being, of course, that they weren't really looking for it. And after 18 years of this, In 1997, we saw the election of New Labour under the slogan, "Things can only get better." A landslide victory, an astonishing 179 overall majority in Parliament, so sick and tired with the public of the discredited neoliberal prescriptions. And under New Labour, we saw a raft of new legislation aimed at preventing people falling through the safety net into abject poverty, from national minimum wage to working family credits to Sure Start to the social exclusion unit to homeless prevention, etc., etc., etc. A host of social programmes to tackle disadvantage and social exclusion and to get young kids either into work or back into education. But what New Labour singularly failed to do was to reverse the fundamentals of the neoliberal agenda or tackle the major structural factors behind inequalities and disadvantage. They failed to build social housing, they failed to tackle rising rents in the private sector, and they failed to take the utilities back into public ownership. They also failed to regulate the activities of the spivs and the speculators, the casino bankers who fraudulently played hard and fast with other people's money. The end result of which was a financial crash of 2009, the end result of which the government bailing out the financial institutions with over 1.3 trillion of public money, which left the country with a debt of approximately 800 billion. On the back of this, the myth was deliberately propagated by the Conservatives and Lib Dems, and by much of the media, that the country's economic woes were the result of New Labour's profligate spending, and that much of that was going to the feckless work-shy. And of course that was a lie. That was a lie in part because under New Labour, spending as a percentage of GDP barely rose at all over that of the previous Conservative administrations, but also because only 3% of the welfare budget is actually expended on the unemployed. But as Goebbels used to say, if you tell the big lie often enough, most people will come to believe it. Studies have shown that whilst only 3% of the welfare budget goes to the unemployed, the British public assume it to be around 40%. Such a good job have the media and the opportunistic politicians made of peddling their fabrications. And so New Labour lost the 2010 election, and from that point on, we have seen a concerted assault on the poorest and the weakest in society, a concerted assault on the public sector. But before I consider that, I'd first like to provide a little more contextual info on the outcomes of neoliberal economics. The net worth information on screen, I hope you can all see it, is based on data for 2004-05, and includes marketable assets including house equity, cash, shares, bonds and investment trusts. This is 10 years old, but it's the only readily available source at the moment I can get on screen. Believe me, the picture has become much worse since. But even before the final financial crash, we can see that 2% of the population own over a quarter of the nation's wealth, 10% own over half of the wealth of the nation. And because these values don't include personal possessions, they don't include undeclared cash stuffed away in safety deposit boxes at home and abroad, so the real picture was actually somewhat worse than that. Danny Dorling's 2010 book, Injustice: Why Social Inequality Persists, reveals that for all its social programmes under New Labour, the richest 1% of the population captured a higher share of national income than at any time since the early 1930s. Why did this happen? In part because New Labour shifted taxation from the rich to the poor. It cut corporation tax from 33% to 28% and capital gains tax from 40% to 18%. It raised the inheritance tax threshold for couples from £300,000 to £600,000. The rich had never had it so good. And for good measure, the incoming coalition then reduced the top rate of income tax to 45%. And so despite, or perhaps in part because of the recession, the annual Sunday Times Rich List 2015 revealed that the 100 wealthiest people in the UK have as much money as the poorest 18 million, 30% of all the people. And the British richest 1% have accumulated as much wealth as the poorest 55% of the population. That, I believe, is indecent. The combined wealth of the 1,000 richest men and women in Britain has more than doubled in the last 10 years, with a combined fortune of 547 billion, up from 249 billion in 2005. Some recession, but then every cloud has a silver lining. And that is economically damaging for all of us. In March of last year, the Independent Equality Trust think tank estimated that the ever-increasing gulf between rich and poor in Britain is costing the economy more than £39 billion a year. The effects of inequality being measured in financial terms through its impact on health, well-being and crime rates. This was followed in December of last year with the OECD stating that inequality in the UK was at such levels that it has significantly hampered economic growth, costing the economy almost 9 percentage points between 1990 and 2010, i.e. because of the huge scale of inequality, we had lost almost 10% of our economic growth. And of course we all know who's been made to pick up the tab for the economic crash, not the rich but the poor. A study in 2012 found that 77% of financing the budget deficit was coming from public expenditure cuts and benefit cuts, and only 23% was being repaid by tax increases. And more than half of those tax increases were accounted for by the VAT rise, which hits the poorest the hardest. None of the tax increases, none, were specifically aimed at the super rich. In March 2013, even the Coalition's own Business Secretary, Vince Cable, admitted to being disturbed at the spending review for 2015-16, was working on an assumption that 85% of the further deficit reduction would come from spending cuts and only 15% from tax rises. So much for we are all in this together. So that virtually anyone dependent on any welfare benefit in Britain has seen their income diminish considerably since 2010, and I don't need to tell you what that means in terms of the suffering and the anguish. We've seen a huge rise in food bank usage in 2004, 14 and 15 thus far. In just over 2 years, 1,084,000 people were given 3 days emergency funding from Trust food banks. 1,084,000 people, which compares to 25,000 people, 899 in 2008-9. Benefit delays, low income and benefit changes were the primary reasons for referral, according to the Trust. We've seen a massive squeeze on local authority provision. The more they cut, the more they're told to cut. Analysis by the LGA show that the funding gap for councils between March 2014 and the end of 2015-16 will be 5.8 billion. The total funding gap is forecast to increase year on year until 2019-20, when it will reach £12.4 billion. It's estimated that 1.3 million jobs will have gone from the public sector by 2020. And just as their services are needed to fill those gaps, we've seen the withdrawal of state support for voluntary and community sector organisations in this big society of ours. Cameron's strategy has been to pretend that we're all in it together and we're all feeling the pinch, but no one buys that anymore. Another far more successful strategy has been the engineering of a media blackout on the worst consequences of the cuts, the suicides, the demonstrations, the rise in homelessness. And at the same time, the Tories have revisited the mantra of the deserving and undeserving poor, a cry that their friends in the media have taken up with gusto, demonising welfare recipients and softening up the public for the onslaught against them. And when I say their friends in the media, I do mean their friends. I assume you all recognise the Murdochs and Rebecca Wade by now, but for those of you who don't know, on the right there are the Lebedevs, owners of the so-called Independent newspaper and the Evening Standard, both of which called for the Tories for the last election. The far right has a clear dominance in the media. The Sun, the Daily Mail, the Telegraph and the Daily Express have a joint readership of approximately 5.5 million per day, compared with the Guardian's 180,000. And then there's, of course, Murdoch's Sky TV. And if we look to this next slide, we can also see the huge impact of conservative thinking pundits on the BBC's mainstream political coverage. The ubiquitous Andrew Neil, slightly to the right of Genghis Khan, and David Dimbleby chairing Question Time, where right-of-centre panellists consistently outnumber all others. And of course the BBC's political editor, Nick Robinson, ex-chair of the Federation of Conservative Students, at a time when those clever little boys and girls were running around with Hang Nelson Mandela t-shirts on. With good reason, it's become known as the Bullingdon Broadcasting Corporation. Why does this matter? Well, it matters for many reasons, but the reason it matters in relation to today's conference is because this inbuilt class bias in government and the media combines to enable them to deliberately and casually demonise the poor and castigate them for all of the perceived ills of society. So let's take a look at how people with disabilities have fared over the past several years. They've been hit by a series of measures impacting adversely on their finances, their health and their well-being. In 2008, New Labour brought in US firm ATOS to undertake work capability assessments, and from the outset, it was clear that their agenda was to withdraw people's benefits regardless of their physical or mental condition. And then along came the coalition in 2010 with their welfare reform agenda. Regardless of actual need, the coalition stated their intention to make cuts of $2 billion or 20% to DLA, along with $2 billion of cuts to employment and support allowance. Not unnaturally, this sent a green light to ATOS. Their assessments were criticised by doctors as fundamentally flawed, with the inquisitors lacking medical expertise, and a large percentage of decisions were eventually overturned on appeal. ATOS staff were caught out on Facebook, referring to claimants as, quote, parasitic wankers and down and outs. Citizens Advice Scotland have found that among the claimants deemed fit for work were people suffering from Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, bipolar disorder, heart failure, stroke, severe depression and terminal cancer, often against the advice of their own doctors and other specialists. Coroner's reports on suicides have noted the stress of the assessment and appeals process as a contributory factor. Under Cameron's premiership, disabled people are also losing access to job seekers allowance at a rate of over $10,000 per month through the JSA sanctions regime. Evidence was given to the Oakley Review of claimants being told you need to spend 35 hours per week doing job searches and show evidence of 50 to 100 job searches or job applications per week. Hardly surprising then that Osborne was booed when he had the audacity to turn up at the Paralympics medal ceremonies. But in the media we've seen a virtual news blackout of the impact of the disability cuts. We've also seen the deliberate demonisation of those on disability benefits, indeed on any benefits, so as to soften up the public to the cuts. How would you like a £91.40 inflation-linked grant every week for the rest of your life, just for sitting on your backside? You'd need a £200,000 lottery win for that sort of income. Yet more than 1.6 million people in Britain today have won the jackpot by going on the sick. Some are genuinely unable to work, but countless thousands are having a laugh at the expense of sun readers, and others who do get out of bed turn up for work and pay taxes to fund the £12.5 billion bill for their feckless lifestyles. Kavanagh, The Sun, 4th of April 2011. There are many, many more examples. This recategorisation of the disabled as work-shy has been well documented by the Glasgow Media Group in their Bad News for Disabled report, which is freely downloadable from their website. There has, as a consequence, been a huge increase in hate crime against the disabled, ranging from verbal abuse to grievous bodily harm. A Comrades poll commissioned by Scope in May 2011 found that more than 58% of disabled people in London had experienced hostility, aggression or violence from a stranger because of their condition or impairment. And if we now look at poverty, the welfare state, we are told, has become an enormous burden because developed in which idleness and living beyond one's means is rewarded and work and thrift is penalised. This myth has been pushed again and again by politicians and their friends in the media. Ministers argue that they have to cap benefits because no one on benefits should be better off than those in work, seemingly oblivious to the fact that many of those in receipt of benefits are actually in work but being paid below a living wage. But hey-ho, let's not let reality get in the way of a nice little neoliberal soundbite. The majority of children and working age adults in poverty in the UK live in working, not workless households. That's 6.1 million people, 2 million children, 4.1 million adults. 63% of children in poverty in this country are in working families. Low pay is the biggest cause of poverty in this country. A fifth of British workers are paid less than the living wage, and over the past decade, the real value of wages has dropped alarmingly in relation to household bills. And the never-ending wage freeze for Britain's 5 million public sector workers simply serves to exacerbate that situation. And the more people that end up on zero-hours contracts, there are now over 1 million jobs being offered on these terms, the worse the situation gets. A few more statistics. The DWP themselves acknowledged last year that the bedroom tax and housing benefit cuts had thrown 523,000 tenants into arrears. Who benefits from this? No one but the loan sharks and the bailiff companies. And then there's benefit sanctions. The number of financial penalties imposed by the DWP now exceeds the number of fines imposed by our courts. In Great Britain in 2013, there were over 1 million sanctions on JSA claimants, 32,000 on employment and support allowance claimants, and 44,000 on low employment claims. By contrast, magistrates and sheriff courts imposed a total of only 849,000 fines. And of course, sanctioned benefit claimants are treated much worse than those fined in the courts. The latter can negotiate payment in stages in relation to their financial circumstances. For the majority of those sanctioned by the DWP, the sanctions lead to immediate loss of income. Decisions on guilt are made in secret by officials who are subject to constant management pressure to maximise penalties, and the claimant is neither present nor legally represented. The majority of sanctions are for relatively trivial matters such as missing a single interview with a job centre or for not making as many job applications as the job centre demands. It's not difficult to see why those with a disability, lone parents, people with mental health problems and people in rural areas with inadequate public transport are disproportionately sanctioned. And here's an outcome of those compassionate coalition policies. David Clapson, a diabetic ex-soldier, having his £71.70 weekly allowance sanctioned for missing a meeting at a job centre. 3 weeks after his benefits were stopped, he died due to not taking his insulin. His electricity card was out of credit, meaning that the fridge where he should have kept his diabetes insulin chilled was not working. David had worked for 29 years and spent 5 years in the army. In recent years, he was a carer for his sick mother. When he died, he had just £3.44 to his name, 6 tea bags, a tin of soup, and an out-of-date can of sardines. The coroner found he had no food in his stomach. So hearty congratulations to Ian Duncan Smith and David Cameron and the Orange Book Lib Dems keeping them in power during the coalition years for another victory for neoliberal prescriptions. No wonder the food banks are inundated. Indeed, last year's all-party parliamentary inquiry into hunger and food banks in Britain clearly evidenced that benefit sanctions are one of the major causes of the rise in the need for emergency food support. And then Tory MPs tell us that the feckless are abusing food banks so that they can spend their disposable income on consumer goods. And they tell us that organisations like the Trussell Trust running the food banks are politically motivated, and that Oxfam's Poverty in the UK campaign was politically motivated, and the Archbishops of York and Canterbury are politically motivated for displaying compassion about the plight of the poor. They really are something, the Tories. Everyone is politically motivated except them. And then there's the ever-rising fuel bills as the energy companies make vast fortunes. This perfect storm of calculated assaults on their income has meant that over the past 4 years, the least well-off in British households have lost 6% of their income per year. While the British Gas Managing Director walked away with 13 million. And then there's the other great myth that the country's been bled dry by benefit cheats, and you see the posters everywhere. You see them in Hull at least once or twice a year on all the bus stops, everywhere asking you to shop benefit cheats. But the reality is that the government's own figures show that just 0.7% or £1 billion of benefit expenditure is overpaid due to fraud. Now compare that to the estimated 70 billion lost to the Treasury through illegal tax evasion, most of it by the very wealthy. And of course the majority of those benefit cheats working on the side are doing it to get an extra £30 or £40 per week, the difference between having some kind of social life or no life at all. They do it because the meagre benefits they receive are condemning them and their children to a life of social exclusion. Here's a poster I'd like to see in every DWP office and every housing benefit office. If you can't read it at the back, it says, it's not a handout, it's not welfare, it's not something for nothing, It's money from the government, from a fund you paid into when times are hard, and it belongs to you. But of course the red top newspapers are only too happy to join in with the myths and the fallacies. And then there's the chaff designation thrown at those at the bottom end of the socio-economic ladder. And it's not just the newspapers creating these false images, it's all over our television screens too, those silver spoon, privately educated boys and girls who dominate the TV networks, churning out a plethora of benefit pornography. The so-called reality TV programmes where working class participants are goaded into acting garishly in front of the cameras, from the hideous Jeremy Kyle show to Benefit Street, to Benefits Britain, to Benefits by the Sea, turning poverty into entertainment, and that pathetic little man Dominic Littlewood and his endless pursuit of benefit sheets with all the usual language of crooks, thieves and scroungers. Not unnaturally, some people get annoyed at these caricatures. This is what the Middlesbrough fans had to say about it last year. Being poor is not entertainment. And here's public schoolboy Matt Lucas in Little Britain playing Vicky Pollard in 2012. Actually calling him a mere public schoolboy does him a disservice. He went to Haberdasher's Aske's Boys' School in Hertfordshire, which in 2012 was held by the Daily Telegraph to be the top independent boys' school in the country. Approximately 1/5 of the student body goes on to study at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge. Now here's how the BBC's own website on Little Britain refers to the Vicky character. Vicky Pollard is your common or garden teenage delinquent, the sort you can see hanging around any number of off-licences in Britain, trying to persuade people going inside to buy them 10 fags and a bottle of white lightning. If you haven't read Owen Jones's Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class, and his sequel, The Establishment and How They Get Away with It, can I suggest that you do, please? They cover in great detail how the public school elites who run politics and the media in this country have systematically stereotyped the working class and the poor in order to further their narrow political agendas. And of course we should all know that this is nonsense. It's an insult to the millions in working class communities who are either in work or are desperately seeking work, who are trying to carve out a better life for themselves and their families, or who are acting as unpaid carers to an infirm relative or volunteering in their local community. But the end result of this vilification has been an exponential rise in hate crime against those on benefits. A study last year found that 15% of claimants had been verbally abused for receiving state provision and 4% had been physically attacked for the same reason. That translates nationally into 800,000 claimants facing verbal abuse and 200,000 facing actual physical abuse. And on it goes. In this year's general election, the Tories' fear agenda around the national debt persuaded just enough of the public into supporting austerity to get them elected, even though the debt in 2010 was not even a quarter of the size of the public debt after World War II, when Labour managed to establish the NHS, establish legal aid, massively improve pensions, introduce disability benefits, rebuild and expand public infrastructure, construct 200,000 new houses a year, and on and on and on. But austerity, as it has played out in recent years as an economic strategy, is morally wrong. It is morally wrong because it's forced those who have least to give to bear the vast majority of financial and social burden. It has forced those who did not cause the economic crisis to bear that burden, while those who caused it, the financiers and the bankers, continue to enrich themselves at our expense. Bankers' bonuses continue unabated, even in the bailed-out banks, and not a single perpetrator has faced a criminal trial. Austerity is also economically wrong. By restricting the demand side of the economy, it has engendered the longest slump in living memory, decimating our manufacturing base in the same way that Thatcherism did in the 80s. Don't take my word for this. Read the recent IMF reports that state clearly that austerity measures have slowed down the UK's economic recovery, or commentary by Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who states categorically that austerity has been a disaster for the British economy. Quote, "Harsh austerity in depressed economies isn't necessary and does major damage when it's imposed. That was true of Britain 5 years ago and is still true today. This he terms the austerity delusion." He continues, It's been astonishing from a US perspective to witness the limpness of Labour's response to the austerity push. Britain's opposition has been amazingly willing to accept claims that budget deficits are the biggest economic issue facing the nation, and has made hardly any effort to challenge the extremely dubious proposition that fiscal policy under Blair and Brown was deeply irresponsible, or even the nonsensical proposition that this supposed fiscal irresponsibility caused the crisis of 2008 and 9. And because austerity as an economic prescription has failed, contrary to his claims, George Osborne has added more to Britain's debt in his 5 years as Chancellor than New Labour did in its entire 13 years in government. Economic figures from the Office for National Statistics in 2013 revealed that the coalition had borrowed £430 billion over 3 years, and that despite selling off yet more public assets to the city and overseas speculators. Now, how often did you hear that rather pertinent fact in the media election coverage? So it's worth repeating that austerity has failed by its own terms. And just to ram home the point, here's a graphic of that George Osborne lesson in fiscal rectitude. Well done, George. And yet, what did we see in July's budget? More of the same. We all know what that translates into. It means that public sector workers, some of the lowest paid in the country, will see another 5 years of real terms wage cuts. It means more poverty for the poorest, with benefit levels frozen. And the Institute for Fiscal Studies estimating that some 13 million families would lose on average £260 per year, with the poorest 10% of families losing up to £800 a year. It means hundreds of thousands more will be in poverty by 2020. It means children living in squalid accommodation and shivering under their blankets because their parents can't afford to turn the heating on. It means parents going without meals so their kids can eat. It means disabled people stuck in their home 24 hours a day because local authority services have been slashed. It means that according to an Age UK report last month, the state of elderly care in the UK is, quote, unacceptable in a civilised society. That savage cuts to social care budget have left more than 1 million people in England having a care need such as getting out of bed or going to the toilet, but who receive no assistance with it from the state, self-funded care services or from friends and family. And yes, it means yet more suicides and ever-increasing numbers of people falling into debt because of bedroom tax, benefit cuts and benefit sanctions. And of course, if we go back to that post-war consensus and the underlying optimism that the next generation were better off than their parents, we'll consider the parlous circumstances that most young people find themselves in today. According to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, the incomes of those aged between 22 and 30 are down 8% on what they were in 2007. Their wages have collapsed, median earnings dropping by some 15% in real terms between 2008 and 2013. Almost 30% of all 22 to 30-year-olds are now in absolute poverty. We've seen yet more restrictions on housing benefit for 18 to 21-year-olds. Higher education tuition fees have escalated. Grants have been scrapped. We've seen early intervention funding slashed from £3.2 billion in 2010 to £1.5 billion today. I could go on and on and on, but I don't have to tell you, you see this carnage every day at the coalface. The period of austerity has coincided with one of the biggest upwards transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich in British history. We now see the greatest disparities of income and wealth since Victorian times. And the key thing is that none of this is inevitable. None of it is necessary. It's about political choices. It is a deliberate and callous strategy by a government hell-bent on its ideological mission to reduce the state to the absolute minimum and to destroy the welfare state. And they are succeeding in this to an alarming degree. I repeat, it's about political choices. Whilst Osborne is slashing £12 billion from the welfare state over the next 4 years, every year the government hands out £93 billion in corporate welfare, in subsidies, grants and reduced tax rates to corporations. And of course, corporation tax is to be reduced to 18% by 2020. So, after such a depressing analysis, what can I possibly impart today about how the Advice Centre can impact positively on poverty and well-being? Well, I think you're doing a good job anyway, in fairness. But I think there are several things. The first thing is that while swimming against the huge tides of government and media disinformation, you should continue to believe in what you're doing, in assisting the most disadvantaged in our communities to survive this assault on their life chances and their dignity. The second is to continue to make that case to others and to have the courage to stand up to the government and the media and challenge their assertions. The third is a message about respect and disrespect. It is this: please continue to treat your clients with respect. I'm sure most of you do, I'm sure all of you do. There are no deserving and undeserving poor, there are just the poor. And at the same time, please feel free to show contempt for those obnoxious, privileged, venal politicians who are inflicting these appalling circumstances upon our communities. It's not enough to try to alleviate the damage they're causing. We need to challenge them, to disrespect them and demonise them every much as they disrespect and demonise the weak and the poor. Here's an interesting slide I found on the internet last year, directed at Ian Duncan Smith. Forget the fact that I scammed the taxpayer for expenses as Tory leader, that I married a millionaire and still claim the dough, and that I lied about my education and army rank. Listen to me when I say I want to end the something-for-nothing culture of entitlement that you lot have. Despicable human being. And we also need to build a movement for a new political agenda in this country, one that rejects the selfishness and the greed of neoliberalism and restores to the national psyche those values of community, mutual respect and compassion that neoliberalism has stripped away from our lives. We must stop punishing the poor, the vulnerable and the young. There are only two ways out of poverty for the bulk of the British population. That is providing them with permanent well-paid jobs, or for those not in work or who cannot work, welfare benefits based on a citizen's income, not on the pittance they get today, the absolute minimum required to get by. All else, I'm afraid, is peripheral. And if we want to live in a civilised society, there's no two ways about it. We need to tax the rich. We need to stop tax evasion and tax avoidance and put those we catch at it in prison. We need to stop giving public handouts to large corporations unless they provide full-time, secure jobs that pay the living wage. And we need to build a society in which social mobility flourishes, a society for your children and mine, not just for those of the wealthy and the powerful. We are well into the fourth decade of neoliberalism, with all the damage it has done. But finally, a new wind of change is blowing across this nation. It crystallised into the anti-austerity campaigns of the Greens and the SNP, and it now has a flag bearer in Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party. The traditional media are running a campaign of vilification and fear, attacking Corbyn on a daily basis. With the growth of Twitter and Facebook, Murdoch's power diminishes daily. I believe we are now at a watershed moment. We can have more of the same, misery heaped upon misery, injustice heaped upon injustice, or we can support the movement for real change, for a return to the positive values of community, compassion, respect and hope. Needless to say, I've invested my £3 to give me the right to vote in the Labour Party leadership contest on a Jeremy Corbyn, Tom Watson ticket. Feel free to join me, and thank you for listening.